Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
All right, welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is your new day. It's Monday, April 9th, 6 o'clock here in New York. And here's the starting line. We're going to begin with breaking news this morning. Russia's defense ministry claims that Israel carried out airstrikes on a Syrian airbase after that suspected chemical weapons attack in the suburbs of Damascus that killed dozens of people, including children. We'll show you the pictures. Something was obvious and ugly at play there. The big question is whether the U.S. will take military action once again without congressional approval, or will the U.S. withdraw, as President Trump had suggested. That suggestion now being weighed as part of what may have emboldened the attack. President Trump talking tough, warning Assad there would be, quote, a big price to pay for attacking his people again. And in a rare show of severity, really, Mr. Trump called out Vladimir Putin by name. This was the first time, and he said, stop supporting Assad.
So the White House is facing several global and domestic crises as the president's new national security advisor, John Bolton, begins his first day in the West Wing. And there are questions about Chief of Staff John Kelly's influence and the future of embattled EPA Chief Scott Pruitt. Plus, a CNN exclusive. Sources tell us that President Trump has begun the initial steps of preparing for a possible interview with special counsel Robert Mueller's investigators. This is the clearest sign yet that President Trump and his legal team remain open to an interview. So let's begin our coverage with CNN's Fred Pleitgen. He's live in Damascus, Syria, with all of the breaking news there. Fred.
Yeah, some pretty developments, Allison, happening overnight and indeed the entire weekend. Now, as far as those airstrikes against that Syrian military base is concerned, you guys have already said that the Syrian government says that the Israelis were responsible. The Russians are saying the same thing. They say Israeli warplanes flew over Lebanese territory and fired 8 missiles at that airbase. 5 of them were apparently intercepted, but 3 of them then hit that base, killing several people on the ground. We know, of course, that the Israelis suspect that there might be Iranian operatives on the ground there. And then you have that suspected chemical weapons attack in that outskirt of Damascus. That's actually only about 8 miles from where I am standing right now. That happened in the night from Saturday into Sunday, and the opposition says that Syrian government helicopters were flying over that area, dropped canisters, and all of a sudden people on the ground got severe respiratory problems, and thousands of people dozens of people, were killed as a result of that. The opposition obviously blames the Syrian government. The Syrian government, for its part, has issued a strong rebuttal saying they were not responsible. They do acknowledge that there was an offensive going on in that area at the time, but they said that they were making such big advances that they did not need any sort of unconventional weapons to make sure that their advance goes much quicker. In fact, that territory, which is called Douma, just outside of Damascus, has since then been essentially won back by the Syrian government, the rebels that were down there on the ground leaving that area. So as you can see, both sides trading barbs, and once again, as we've seen so many times, guys, in this conflict, the civilians suffering the most, Allison.
Okay, Fred, it's so helpful to have you on the ground there. Thank you very much. We'll check back with you through the program. President Trump vowing there will be a, quote, big price to pay. So how will he respond to the reported chemical weapons attack in Syria? CNN's Caitlin Collins is live at the White House with more. What have you learned, Caitlin?
Well, Allison, one heck of a day for the new National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who officially starts in his role here at the White House today. But overall, a very pivotal day for this administration, because just days ago, President Trump was vowing to get U.S. troops out of Syria. But the question now is, does an attack this grisly just pull him back in?
President Trump warning that there will be a big price to pay for a suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria. 1 year after authorizing missile strikes against a Syrian airbase after a sarin gas attack left dozens dead.
Every nation, all peoples have all agreed and have agreed since World War II is an unacceptable practice. So I wouldn't take anything off the table.
The president calling out Russian President Vladimir Putin by name for the first time, blaming Russia and Iran for backing the Syrian president, who Mr. Trump nicknamed Animal Assad. Syria denying involvement and Russia firing back, calling the reported chemical attack a hoax and warning that using far-fetched and fabricated pretexts for a military intervention in Syria is absolutely unacceptable and can lead to the most serious consequences. President Trump also pointing the finger at his predecessor for not following through on his threat that the use of chemical weapons would be crossing a, quote, red line. But in 2013, Mr. Trump also opposed a strike, repeatedly tweeting, "Do not attack Syria." The suspected chemical attack coming just days after President Trump said he wants to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, ignoring near unanimous advice from his military advisors.
I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now.
Senator John McCain faulting the president for those public statements, saying that Assad and his backers heard him and have been emboldened by American inaction.
Well, it's a defining moment in his presidency. They see us, our resolve breaking. They see our determination to stay in Syria waning. And this no accident, they use chemical weapons. But President Trump can reset the table here.
I think the president is going to have to reconsider his plan for an early withdrawal in light of what has happened.
President Trump speaking about the Syrian attack with the leaders of France and Iraq. The White House's readout of the call with France, noting that the two leaders agreed to exchange information and coordinate a strong joint response.
Now, Chris and Allison, we are waiting further response from the White House. Right now, they're saying nothing is off the table. It certainly will be the topic of the day here at the White House as the president holds a cabinet meeting around lunch and then meets and has a briefing with senior military leadership later on today.
All right, Caitlin, thank you very much. It's not unusual to get mixed messages from Donald Trump when it comes to this type of action. He's clearly been against it personally, but he was convinced otherwise once he became president. What will happen now? Let's bring in CNN political analyst David Gregory and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. And gentlemen, let's remind people why the situation seems to have changed on the ground. We usually, we try to protect the audience. I'm not really sure why. That's a different discussion for a different day.
Well, it is very graphic. We should let them know.
What you're going to see should disturb you, but it's also real, and it's the reality, and the United States government has to decide what it's going to do about it. Here are some of the images of whatever was dropped on these civilians did to them. You will see that people are lying lifeless. You will see that is non-concussive. Which suggests that this was a chemical agent or a non-conventional weapon. You will see foam coming out of their mouths, which is, again, you don't have to be a nuclear physicist to understand that this is some type of toxic agent.
And you also see children, by the way.
There are children, there are families. This is the kind of bombing that's been going on all along there, David Sanger. So in terms of what this means for the state of play on the ground, you heard Lindsey Graham there saying, maybe the suggestion that we were leaving showed a lack of resolve and emboldened this kind of attack. That's speculation done by a member of the president's own party. But how serious this offense, and how serious should the U.S. consider military action?
Well, it is speculation, but it's a pretty good bet. And the reason for that, Chris, is that the president has moved between periodic interest in humanitarian intervention, and that's what the strike a year ago was after a fairly significant chemical attack, and his discussion of pulling the U.S. out because he fundamentally believes the United States does not have many national interests in the Syrian war. So this puts the two parts of Donald Trump in complete opposition here. On the one hand, he says we shouldn't be anywhere in the world where the United States' interests aren't immediately at stake. And that was what was behind his statement, let someone else handle us. It's time for others to go handle it. And then he sees an image like this, horrible, an awful thing, clearly appeared to be the use of either a chemical agent, chlorine, something like that. And he talks about coming in to bomb again. The problem with this, Chris, is bombing is an immediate response, but it doesn't get at the central issue. And after you're gone, of course, Assad comes to the conclusion he can go try this again.
So, David Gregory, obviously, President Trump was quite critical of President Obama back in 2013 when there was a red line that President Obama laid down, and then President Trump felt, Donald Trump at the time felt that that was really not a good strategy to mention that. So then President Trump tweets out that there will be a, quote, big price to pay. Do you hear that as his own red line?
Well, I don't see how you read it any other way. And I think it's also a confirmation that when President Trump tweets, that is policy. because if this is just an idle tweet, then this is a big threat, a big push of Vladimir Putin, only with no follow-through. But to David's point, this is the issue with targeted, limited airstrikes meant to be a punch in the nose. You know, on the big world order, on the big world stage, that has limited impact because these guys, a guy like Assad, who's a murderous dictator, who's backed by Iran and Russia, can wait these kinds of things out. He's clearly not worried about civilian casualties and those around him because he'll commit his own atrocities. The end game here is getting Assad out of power. It's what the Obama administration wanted, but was not prepared to take by force because it didn't want to own the outcome. Because if you thought Iraq was bad, this sequel would be far worse, far more complicated, and far deadlier for the United States and its allies. And there appears to be no will to go in and take Syria over. So the United States under Trump and even under Obama says, okay, we can't have a failed state. We saw that as a prelude to 9/11. So we want to attack ISIS, get ISIS out of Syria, but you have to own some kind of follow-up, some kind of outcome. And that's where we find ourselves yet again. If the goal is to get rid of Assad, then what comes next? And what is the United States prepared to do to own that outcome?
Well, I mean, obviously you have a very divided head here because the president clearly doesn't want to be in that kind of business. He's been, you know, very resolute about that over the years. You have the fact that Israel, to your point, David Sanger, seemed to be the proxy agent here, if the reports are true about who sent these missiles down and may have done some damage on one of the bases. But then you have the bigger question, which is because Trump is not of one mind on this kind of stuff, he really doesn't need to be, because what is the legal authority for the President of the United States to unilaterally start any military action in Syria? I mean, this is something that really bollocksed up Obama, right? He wound up going to Congress and saying, really, you guys are supposed to do this. You then had Paul Ryan say we have to take our power back from the executive. What power has been punted more to the executive than declaring war? You heard Susan Collins, Graham, McCain talking about this. Isn't it their job to get the ideas from the president and the military and vote on whether or not the U.S. takes military action? This isn't a national security threat.
Well, it's not a national security threat to us, and all of the action that you've seen in Syria has really been done under the authorization to use military force that passed right after 9/11. Now,
how does that apply? You know, I mean, how does that apply legally?
It's a pretty far stretch because it went after al-Qaeda and then it was interpreted to allow going after ISIS. But in a case like this, a humanitarian intervention, there is no legal basis under the authorization to use military forces. The attack here was against, it was an awful thing, but it was against the Syrian people and therefore against all kinds of international law. I mean, I could imagine.
But that takes UN resolutions.
That's right. You could take Assad up in the International Criminal Court. But for a military strike, it doesn't provide much of an authorization. Now, this gets at the strategic incoherence of the Syria policy. President Obama hesitated to go take the military action because he didn't know what would happen the day after, and he attempted and failed to bring about a diplomatic solution to the civil war. President Trump is not really engaged in any diplomatic action there. He is simply hoping that the periodic threat of military strikes would stop these kinds of chemical attacks. Clearly, they have not. It stopped for a while after last year's attack, and then they've been resuming gradually until what we saw happen over the weekend. And there's no reason to think it would play out any differently, even if he does strike, which I suspect he will in the next few days.
And the larger strategic game is, what is the United States prepared to do to drive an outcome that is not going to be achieved militarily? The outcome is going to be what has stagnated here over the past few years, an effort to talk to Russia, to get Iran involved, to get Turkey involved and others, to change regimes. But you see, Russia has a much bigger interest in Syria than the United States does. Access to a deep water port, propping up its proxies in the area to have influence in the region. And the United States doesn't want to assert its interest beyond making sure that this doesn't become a safe haven for ISIS. So that's what the president has to get his head around and his interests around, because what he's articulated over the past couple of weeks is a very nationalist argument, which is we've got no dog in the fight in Syria. We should just bring those troops home, something he said was, the mistake of previous administrations. Well, now he sees himself pulled right back in, and the question laid down in front of him, especially with an incredibly hawkish national security advisor who once wanted to attack Iran, in John Bolton, is how are they going to attack taking on Russia and challenging them to be part of a bigger solution in Syria that prevents these kinds of attacks in the future?
Well, those questions begin in earnest this morning when John Bolton takes his position officially. So obviously it'll be a very interesting day at the White House. David Sanger, David Gregory, thank you very much. These reports that on March 28th, so recently, John Kelly was so frustrated that Mattis and Nielsen, Homeland Security Secretary, had to calm him down. He has grown quite flummoxed by the lack of, I guess, control in the White House that he has. What are we to make of this?
Flummoxed. I mean, he apparently had a little mini intervention by his friends to say, don't get too frustrated. Don't get so frustrated you're thinking about quitting. Apparently, he went home that day a little early and said, I'm out of here. And some people interpreted that as a threat to quit. Look, being chief of staff to President Trump has got to be one of the worst, most powerful jobs in the world. Because you're only as good as chief of staff as the confidence the president gives you. But Trump doesn't want to be managed. He needs to be managed, but he doesn't want to be. So there's a natural tension there. Kelly had been really controlling access. Now Trump is allegedly trying to throw that off. And those friction points at some point will explode. I don't think it would be a good thing for the Trump White House if Kelly went out the door, though.
David Gregory, I've been on vacation, so help me, remind me, why do we care so much about each of the incremental machinations of what is obvious chaos in the White House? They can deny it all they want. We know it's not true. We know there's dysfunction. We know that they have problems there. But, going into each new iteration of it, where does it get us?
Well, I don't think it gets us very far, but I think there is, as I always say, part of this dysfunction becomes more serious and less amusing when you're facing a crisis like Syria. You're looking at the prospect of U.S. intervention, because there again, process matters, decision-making matters. And what you've got is this cycle of a chief of staff who's very frustrated by the fact that the chief executive is taking control of decisions, keeping him out of the loop. Obviously, Trump himself, is feeding questions of whether Kelly still has influence by the actions he takes or by leaks that the president, makes himself. And so there's this kind of fighting back and forth. Ultimately, if you are a member of Congress or the congressional leadership, if you're a foreign leader, you have to wonder who's really speaking for the president, who's really in control in the White House, who has real influence over the White House. And I think these things do tend to matter. I think this idea that the president likes to have a kind of chaotic management style means he likes
claim to be champions of.
ISIS is nearly defeated, but the arrogance of their beliefs is not. What keeps you awake at night?
There's these lice in my clothes, in the place I'm sleeping.
So there will be some people who see you make a joke of that question and think that whatever's gone before to you